Good afternoon, and welcome to our live stream today for a discussion about the Social Studies TEKS and about social studies and the importance of that in the state of Texas. We here at the Foundation are very committed to a strong civics education because it is really the cornerstone of our society. In our Constitution, the purpose of public education is established as the purpose is to diffuse generally the knowledge that is necessary to preserve the liberties and rights of the people. The founders of this nation and this state saw this as the most important law that was on the books. And to this day, the Texas legislature has required the teaching of informed American patriotism. I'd like to start us off with a quote from Abraham Lincoln about the importance of education, and then I'll go ahead and introduce our two esteemed panelists, both members of the State Board of Education. Abraham Lincoln explained the importance of education in this way, and it still resonates today. Upon the subject of education, I can say that I view it as the most important subject which we as a people can be engaged in, that every man may receive at least a moderate education, and thereby be enabled to read the histories of his own and other countries, by which he may duly appreciate the value of our free institutions. This appears to me to be an object of vital importance. This work is absolutely essential, and for that reason, we're very excited to be joined today by two members of the State Board of Education, Chairman Kevin Ellis and Member Pat Hardy. Chairman Ellis represents District 9 on the State Board. That's Northeast Texas, everywhere from Atlanta, Texas, down to Lufkin. He represents 31 counties in East Texas. He is a member of the board's Committee on School Finance and Permanent School Fund, and he has served on the State Board since 2016. Before that time, he served on the Lufkin ISD Board of Trustees, including as the board president. He is a chiropractor and has operated Alice Chiropractic since 1998. He's very active in his local community, serving on many local boards. So we welcome Chairman Kevin Ellis. I'd also like to introduce Member Pat Hardy. Mrs. Pat Hardy has been a member of the State Board of Education since November of 2002. She has served on all three of the board's committees and currently serves on the board's Committee on School Finance and the Permanent School Fund. She retired in 2017 as an instructional specialist for the Weatherford Independent School District. She has previously taught for 30 years as a world history and world geography teacher at Castleberry High School in Fort Worth. District 11, which she represents, stretches all the way from North Tarrant County all the way over to Glen Rose in the southwest of the district. So thank you very much for joining us, Pat, today as well. So I'd like to open it up with kind of just a basic question about the State Board of Education. The State Board is made up of 15 members. Can you talk us through what topics the State Board of Education works on?
Sure. And I think there's often a big misunderstanding about what we do. And when I go to dinner parties or based on emails that I get or what I see on social media, I think more people really don't understand what we do as compared to what we do. But the legislature has granted us a laundry list of about 30-something different duties that we have that the legislature has granted us. But we have what I consider three main duties. Now, one of them, I mentioned the laundry list of duties that the legislature has given us. We have one constitutional duty, and that constitutional duty is to manage the Permanent School Fund. Permanent School Fund is a $50 billion fund that we have co-managed in the past with the General Land Office, and this might be another story for another day. But now we are combining those two funds, which is pretty significant. So that's one of the three most important things we do. Number two is what's brought us here today, and that's to approve the TEKS. As you know, that most states often just use Common Core. Often states talk to another state board member in Arkansas, and essentially their agency, their state agency just develops their curriculum standards. But we do it the Texas way. We do it ourselves. And honestly, if this was the only thing that the State Board of Education did, I would still be excited to hold this post because I think it's critically and vitally important in developing our curriculum standards. We have about 9 subject areas, and we review about once a year. So we have 4 core subjects in English language arts, science, social studies, and math, and then enrichment subjects like CTE and tech apps, health, and such. So that's the second pillar of the three important things that we do. And the third ties into that, and that's adopting the instructional material, or what we used to call the textbooks. Some of it's online now, so we term that instructional material. And that's kind of the tail end of the process of any time that we adopt TEKS. The board has three subcommittees. You mentioned that I serve on the School Finance Committee, as does Ms. Hardy. We have a committee on school initiatives and a committee on instruction. And in those other committees, we work on a lot of other issues, things such as approving charters, appointing board members to the military bases and such as that. On the state board, we have opportunities to serve with legislatures. There's been a couple of committees that the board has had a representative on in the past. We had Ms. Erica Beltran serve on the Next Generation Assessment Accountability Board Commission. I served on the Commission on Public School Finance back in 2018, and Pam Little is currently serving on the Virtual School Commission. So that's just a little quick overview of what the State Board of Education does.
That's really helpful. And so that gives us a good scope of what the state board's jurisdiction is in the vital work of educating our children. If we focus just on the TEKS, so the TEKS are the essential knowledge and skills. They define what students should know and what they should be able to do. Pat, I'm wondering if I can turn it over to you for this one. What is your view about what the SBOE's role should be in defining the TEKS? And then we'll kick it over to Kevin.
Got you on mute, Ms. Hardy.
It's what I always do on the board meetings too.
There we go. We can hear you.
What is most important about the role of the State Board of Education in regard to the TEKS? Many people confuse the word standards with the word curriculum. The curriculum is the how-to, and ours is the overarching, what do you want the kids to know and learn? And so the role of the State Board of Education is to guide that process. And we do it with a number of subjects, but we also get a lot of help from other people. It's not like we write those standards. The State Board has expert reviewers. We bring in, like when we did health, we got a lot of health professionals to give us some guidance and so forth. When it came to social studies, we had some social studies college professors or people that were experts in the field of social studies. So we always have that guidance. We've had some incredible help from those people, but the actual writing of the TEKS comes down to the classroom teacher, the person who is actually using those standards. And so a few years ago, we set up a system where we could bring in more teacher input. In years before, we would have one group would be selected, let's say, to do world history, and that one group was all that looked at world history, might be 6 or 8 people. Now we do it in kind of in rounds. That's confusing to the public, and it's kind of confusing to some of us sometimes, because that's when you would see work group A, work group B, work group C, but they would each take a role, and then they would pass that work on to another set of educators to do that. Ideally, I know one of the big confusions is the looking at grade appropriate grade level subjects. For example, if you're teaching in the 2nd grade, you need to have 2nd grade teachers writing that, because they have an understanding of the appropriateness of what can be done in 2nd grade. And when you get people that are even secondary teachers, they oftentimes don't have an understanding of what a 2nd grader can do. So it's really ideal to get people who have taught world history to be on those committees, people who've taught 5th grade to be on that committee, so that they get the right catch of what should be done. But with a lot of guidance from your expert reviewers, because those are people that are experts in the field. We have several that were like a Texas history expert, someone that can say, yes, this is good, or this isn't a good use of those standards. So, and then working along with the agency, we pull that together, and it comes back. The final straw is carried out by the State Board of Education. And we have been known to go through documents word for word and make whatever changes that we agree upon as a board.
Mm-hmm. And Kevin, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how you've seen the role of the Sboe, what role you've seen the Sboe take in the past. I think the work groups are definitely very helpful to explain to people. And I appreciate Pat's comments about like how they work sequentially. So it's not commonly understood, for example, that like work group A takes a pass, and then work group B takes a pass, and then C and D. Kevin, can you shed a little bit of light about the Sboe's role as well, how you've seen that?
I think when you ask what our role is, I think we have ultimately responsibility. We own the TEKS. We have people who help us through the process, but this is our ultimate responsibility. So we have to take ownership in that. Ms. Hardy described it perfectly about the difference between curriculum and curriculum standards. The way I describe that is the curriculum standards that we do is like the skeleton, where the curriculum that a local district is going to determine is going to be like the flesh and the muscles that go on top of that skeleton. So they are two different things, but it can take anywhere from. That's right. It can be anywhere from 6 months to, I think our English language arts took almost 2 years to get right. Sometimes when we do a revision, we'll do just a streamline. We did that in social studies. I think it was in 2018, when we hear from the field there's too much material in a given school year for teachers to go through. And the way I just describe the streamlining is you're giving a pair of scissors, but no writing utensil. You can only take out, but not add in. That's what we did in 2018. This was more of a full revision that we did, but as she talked about, we have a long process. We start with surveys. The first thing we do is we want to hear from the field. We go to the education service centers and we send out surveys and we compile all that information. We have the content advisors that she mentioned. Normally, 2 of us can appoint one, so there's 7 that are appointed from the State Board of Education, and she described that. When we do a core subject, we also have 2 experts who are appointed by the Commissioner of Higher Education, which we did in this case here. She described work group A and B, but I'm going to add something to that a few years back, our former board chair implemented the what we call the Evergreen Process. So when work group A does their product, you don't have an entirely new work group B. You actually take half of work group A becomes part of work group B. So there's continuity. It's a new, fresh set of eyes, but there's some continuity. And then when work group B, the other half of work group B stays on to become part of work group C along with some new members. So it kind of leapfrogs or stair steps, but it gets new people involved, but it also has continuity from one work group to the previous one. Each one is tasked with a different task. And so sometimes it may be working on historical figures, such as we did in social studies, or it may be a grade band, or it may be a high school one, it may be a middle school. But we task each one with doing different tasks, and they come back to us along the way. Now, when we get to our part of the process, we listen to what they're doing. We get feedback on their process along the way. But all of our decision makings are based in 3 meeting processes. We have a discussion meeting where we typically will do a public hearing, and then we will do a first reading. And then the first reading is called first reading and filing authorization. So we put that in the Texas Register for public comment. And then the second reading and final adoption. So when we actually get our hands on it, we have a 3 meeting process to get us to the end of that process.
Gotcha. That is really helpful, Kevin. And then in thinking about the scope of these topics, so some like literacy or English and language arts, like that's a huge topic. Social studies would be the same. How do can you talk us through what goes into your decision-making process in determining what the scope will be in each review cycle?
Right. And so I think it just depends on what you're looking at. Like CTE, career technical education, changes so often that this was before my time on the board. The board took that up all at one time. And I remember stories of their binders was they were measuring how many feet tall it was. It was literally from the floor up to their desk because there were so many courses. And so we've taken those kind of one bite at a time. We're almost kind of continually revising some CTE courses. But I think to get to the heart of your question, when we decide to do a full revision or a partial revision or a streamlining, is just to take a look and see where we're at with them. And we're all about continuous improvement. So if we're getting feedback that we, on our last revision, had some improvements that we can still make, then we look at that, and we can always do better. That's my philosophy. A couple things when we looked at social studies, there were some weaknesses, I think, in K through 2. just on how vague they were. And that wasn't really in debate. I think almost anyone you talk to would have appreciated that. So when we take up this revision, we definitely wanted to work on elementary, but especially early elementary. One of the other pieces of feedback that we got was the number of strands. We break up all our student expectations into headings or strands, and we had 8 before, and the feedback was that made it very just kind of choppy, that one student expectation would be under one heading, and then it may be a very similar student expectation, but it was under a completely different topic for something else. So the idea is that in case we may look and say, okay, we're going to go from 8 strands to, potentially in the next revision that we'll move down to 4. So we look at feedback from the field and make those decisions.
And
May I say something?
I'm wondering, sorry, go ahead, please.
Got your microphone, Miss Hardy, again.
You're on mute.
Okay.
There we go.
It's still, Kevin, it's not me. But one of the things that's kind of hard to understand, and I hate to admit this, but I was around when we did the first standards in the 90s. So as a teacher, as a practitioner. And so a lot of work went into the original, and I'm speaking on the social studies because a lot of work went into that original framework that we used. And so say in 2012, when we were doing it again, we used the same framework. You didn't have to start from scratch. You already have a framework that you're working from. And what was different about this round was we weren't using the same framework. So at the outset, we thought we were going to be using the same framework and it would not be as long and an arduous process. But then when you change frameworks, then it does make a difference. And so that's where we were last week when we were dropping not or delaying going forward, was because the new framework was very difficult for us to work with. And we wanted to go back to something that was more similar to what had been developed originally in the 90s.
Gotcha. And Pat, drawing on your experience as a classroom teacher, and then also your experience as a state board member, can you sketch out what the state's goal should be for renewing the social studies TEKS? As you mentioned, you all are going to be doing this through 2025. How would you define that goal and sketch that out for the state?
Well, my goal would be to have something that we can all agree is something that we all agree is good for the kids and good for our state. And so we need to have common ground, come to an agreement. But I think that we need to do a little more diving into the research. Kevin said that the standards in grades 1, 2, and 3, and 4 are 1, 2, and 3, K 1, 2, and 3 were very weak and absolutely needed to be beefed up. But also now with Senate Bill 3, we have this obligation to put in more civics in our standards. And this civics needs to be done early. When you talk about certain things, like if you're talking about the preamble or the Declaration of Independence, that needs to be introduced very early. To learn all the intricacies of that, not necessarily, but to introduce it to students so that we have, as a K through 12, a building on our curriculum for civics knowledge and participation in our own governments. And so I think that's one of the things that is going to be studied and needs to be studied. We're trying to work that in right now. But I think that as we go through this, we'll see that we probably need to look at an overhaul of the responsibility of civics education in our K through 12.
And that's, Kevin, I'm wondering if we can pivot over to you and like the timeline that you see for the future, taking into account SB3 and taking into account the recent vote that you all had. Where do you see the state board going over the next 3 years?
So in the near term, what we need to do is implement the changes that are required by SB3. And that, as Ms. Hardy said, talked about putting civics education throughout our standards. So that's what our goal will be before and there was a time requirement that was done by the end of this calendar year. So we have mapped out a timeline where we will have our first reading either later this month or in early October, and then a second reading in either November or December to add the requirements of SB3. And that gets us to that stopping point there. From there, as we talked about in our meeting last week, it's time, I think, where we take a deep breath. We dig into what our goals are for the future social studies revision. We may take up math in the meantime. But in my mind, what I think we need to spend a lot of time doing is really looking at the framework. And some people may not understand what we mean when we say that, but what I'm talking about is what subjects are taught in each grade. Right now we have kind of K through 2 and 3, just kind of some simple, straightforward social studies concepts. And then we have Texas history in 4th and 7th, and U.S. history in 5th and 8th, and world cultures in 6th. And there was a debate about whether we should teach social studies chronologically, starting 3rd grade, moving through world history, and then a combined Texas U.S. history in 5th, 6th, part of 5th, and then 6th, 7th, and 8th. And I think that's, to me, where we really got derailed in this whole process was back to that original concern. If we teach it chronologically, we lose our isolated Texas history. We don't want to do that. But there's also an argument or a benefit where you could teach Texas history in concert with what else was going on in the world. So I think that's where we need to go back to over the next, when we talk about 2023, 2024, is really determining more so in K through 8 what we want each of our children to learn in each grade. And I think once we come to an agreement on that, when we get buy-in from the field, we get feedback from all of our educators, then I think the next part of the process will not be nearly as complicated.
Right.
One of the things that happened is that we really changed the framework in like April, and that did not really allow feedback from the field. And I really want to hear more feedback from the teachers who are responsible for teaching this, because they're going into their end of school testing and then much needed rest, and they were not necessarily focused on what we were doing. So I'm hoping that we can have a whole lot more input from people in the field. That would be both parents and children, and teachers. We probably hear from the kids too, but that definitely needs more of the practitioners of the subject area to do that. We were afraid that we would put another burden on teachers too, because if a teacher's been teaching 4th grade forever, and now all of a sudden she's having to teach a little bit of world history, a little bit of American, a little bit of Texas, that was a strain as well. Also, I happen to know a lot of people in the field, and there was not any real complaint about what we in K1 and 2, where it was very weak. For example, teachers of 4th grade Texas history enjoyed teaching 4th grade Texas history and thought it was a very good course. So the need or desire to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I don't think is there. And that's something I think that we need to, if it is, we need to find out, but we need to hear from more people about that. And that will set us in a path forward.
Based on the conversation and where you all left things at the end of last meeting, it sounds like the board is going to be moving in a similar direction to what we've done in the past, but Texas history may move from 4th to 5th grade and from 7th to 8th grade. That may be a starting point where you all pick up this work in the coming months and years. So it sounds like it's going to be very similar to what people are familiar with in the past. I'm wondering if we can talk just a little bit about the value of spiraling the work over the years so that kids can go take a more surface level pass in the younger years and then go into greater and greater depth as they get older. Could you all speak a little bit about the value of that sort of approach? And if there are alternates to that you recommend, please don't hesitate to point those out as well.
And I'll let the educator, Ms. Hardy, handle most of this, but I'll just point out that a lot of times we talk about spiraling, as you're pointing to, that we do Texas history in fourth and again in seventh, and U.S. history in fifth and eighth, and then in high school. But there's also spiraling that goes along within a given school year where you're coming back from one topic to the other. So I just would point out that spiraling is not just from one grade level to the next or a few years later, but also where you're coming back within the same grade. But Ms. Hardy is probably much more apt or knowledgeable on this topic.
Well, actually, that is true. That's what all of education, that's why they end up with a semester exam, because you have to go back and pick up what you've been studying all throughout the whole semester. But the spiraling process came out of a lot of working together back in the, like I said, in the 90s, and professor of social studies at Texas A&M came up with this through his research and so forth. And I think it's been very successful. Back on the what we left with on Friday, with the fifth grade being the Texas history, or flipping that, fourth grade being U.S. history and fifth grade being Texas history, I think that messes up the whole concept of spiraling. Your spiraling is where you take the what's closest to you, which would be Texas, move it out to U.S., then to world. And I think that is a very good process for social studies to do that. But I really don't like the idea of getting the U.S. before the Texas. But we left that as a starting point, and I think we'll have to have that debate. I also am very proud of the fact that we do a sixth grade world cultures. I think that is unique in the country that we do that. But that's after they get a foundation of Texas. If you look at the Texas Constitution, and then you U.S. with the U.S. Constitution, and then look at what other people and other cultures throughout the world have or don't have, is a simple way of looking at it. Also, what I mentioned earlier about civics education, you want them to have an exposure to these documents so they can be very proud of those documents. But as you build on that, you take those documents and add documents as they get older. And for example, the Mayflower Compact has to be put in there and that sort of stuff. So you add things as you go on, and it does build a foundation that I think is stronger. But what has to happen is that every grade level needs to do their part. And we haven't had that much going on, but the commissioner has promised to reflect more of those founding documents in the upcoming TEKS or STAR test. And I'm hoping that happens so that they'll get more exposure to early writings and so forth.
That's great. And that's something that's established in law as part of informed American patriotism that we're required to teach as the founding documents. And that really gives students an understanding of our highest principles, and then also really a good foundation for understanding who we have been at our best, and then also our failings in the past. Exactly. So that is really great to hear. And then Kevin, in the meeting this month, or last month, I'm sorry, you mentioned a few different things that the Sboe could do to approach the research on TEKS in the future, social studies TEKS. I'm wondering if you could talk through the different examples. You mentioned like a blue ribbon panel, an ad hoc committee, or a TEA draft. Can you talk through what's possible for the Sboe as you proceed to draft these TEKS in the future?
Yeah, we have a few different options. One of them would be similar to the approach that we took in health, and in another subject in the past before I was on the board. I believe it was maybe the last time that we did math, was to ask the commissioner to do a commissioner's draft, where he's able to bring in people from across not just across the state, but from across the country. And that was helpful in getting our health TEKS revision done, just gave us a good starting point. So one option is to ask for the commissioner to take on the task of giving us a commissioner's draft of things, studying like the framework and different issues such as that. We may decide to do that ourselves, and that would look like an ad hoc committee, where we would appoint a committee of ourselves to work in between meetings and so forth, and work through that same process. Or maybe in between those two options would be what I would consider consider like a blue ribbon panel, where it's some Sboe members, someone from the commissioner's office, and then other experts across the field. But some iteration of one of those three that we'll spend some time really doing our homework, digging deeper. Again, we talk about continual improvement, and I think we learned a lot from the last couple of months of going through this process. And if we don't learn from anything we did, we did no good. But if we learn from part of that process and are able to build upon that, then our time was useful. So I think as we move forward, some iteration of some subcommittee type work will be what happens to move us forward.
That's great. And is there anything else you'd like to share with Texans about TEKS drafting, or about social studies in particular, about how they could get involved, or anything else that you'd want them to know?
No, I just, again, would stress the importance of what the State Board of Education does. And I'll go back to Senate Bill 3, or a previous iteration of what became Senate Bill 3 when it was on the House floor. They began to implement a list. I think it got up to about 50 different items that the legislature was going to dictate are part of our TEKS. That's a dangerous precedent. And I don't get on social media much, but I tweeted that night that I tuned into a floor debate on the Texas House floor, and the State Board of Education meeting broke out. And thankfully, they went back in Senate Bill 3 and took all of those items out. But you have an elected State Board of Education body that takes this work very seriously. And I think that's the right way to do this work, as opposed to the legislature dictating what needs to be in. And then you mentioned, is there ways to get involved? We'll do the Senate Bill 3 process. We still have other public hearings that come up. Whatever comes up as we move into future years, we always greatly value the public input, and through groups like yours and others to help us through this process and guide us. We always do appreciate that.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you, Pat, for joining us today for our live stream. We very much appreciate your service and the work that you all do for Texas children. So thank you. And thank you all for joining us for our live stream today. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.